Welcome back to Cherry Becker's Government and Public Sector podcast series. This episode will focus on GASB Statement number 96, subscription-based IT arrangements, what we've seen so far, and what governments should be doing now to implement. I'm Danny Martinez. I'm the Government and Public Sector Accounting Advisory Lead for Cherry Becker. Our group does things such as assisting with financial reporting, audit preparation, as well as implementation of new standards like GASB 87 and 96. With me today is Scott Anderson. Scott, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Scott Anderson. I have been with the firm for a while now, since coming out of college, but spent 2 years recently with the GASB as a practice fellow. As a practice fellow, I basically worked as a project manager, working on some of the latest GASBs to come out, as well as addressed and responded to technical inquiries that some of you all may have had. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Danny.
All right, thanks, Scott. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So GASB 96, what is it and when is it effective?
All right, well, let's start with when it is effective. It is a year behind GASB 87. So what that means is right now you are in your implementation year for GASB 96. So if you're a June 30 year end, it's effective for this upcoming fiscal year. For 12/31, it'll be starting January 1st. So it is around the corner, something to pay attention. And GASB 96 is all about subscription-based information technology arrangements. If you are into acronyms like most of us, SBITA is what we've been referring to it as. And you have to admit it's one of GASB's better acronyms. SBITA is fun to say. But the definition of a SBITA in the guidance is long and is very similar to Leases. And you can read it many times and still not quite understand what a SBITA is. So that's the complicated part of the whole thing. I taught a class last week for an hour, and we spent 30 to 40 minutes of it just talking about what it is, what falls within the scope of the standard, before getting on to the actual accounting. So how's that for not answering your question? Let me answer it this way, though. Let's say for the life of the project, GASB referred to this project as cloud computing arrangements. So when you think about a SBITA, that's what GASB had in mind was those cloud computing arrangements. The trend in recent practice was for governments to get rid of their own IT infrastructure and to go to the cloud. And so the question that had come up in practice was, well, what do we do? How do we account for these arrangements that are millions of dollars and span several years? And so that was the genesis of GASB 96.
Right. Yeah. When you go to the definition, IT software alone or in combination with tangible capital assets, when you look at that definition, some people don't think of other items that when you read it, meet the definitions. So an example that I like to give in the presentations is like the security systems on, say, like buses, right? You're buying the equipment, but oftentimes there's a subscription attached to whatever type of monitoring. And so some of those things, maybe utility reading, some of those electronic readers for utility billing, some of those things, if you read it, the definition sounds like a SBITA, but it may not be what people are currently thinking about. The other thing with the definition that I like to point out when I present is some of the things won't be as hard, in my opinion, related to 87. For example, exchange or exchange-like. Usually, that's if you're buying something from a software vendor, usually it's exchange or exchange-like, right? Where in GASB 87, maybe there were other reasons to enter into those types of contracts. Some things might be harder. We already touched on the definition. That's probably going to be harder. Another one is the period of time, and we'll touch on that later with an exposure draft question, but determining what that period of time for some of these arrangements might be challenging. All right, so we lined up a little bit of what it is and when they need to be caring about it, which is now. What about the accounting? I'm sure if they attend any trainings on 87, they're hearing, well, the accounting is just like Leases. So talk to us about how it is just like Leases and what things maybe are a little bit different than Leases.
So it is just like Leases. you can take a lot of GASB 87 and copy and paste. Now, when I say copy and paste, that does not mean that there was no thought put into this. I mean, there was a lot of time put specifically into this, but when it came to actually putting in the provisions, the board decided it was easier for preparers if they didn't reinvent the wheel, if they made it very consistent. And so you'll see a lot of the same terminology, a lot of the same, the way provisions are worded. In fact, when we did GASB 99, which amended 87, some of the amendments were to make 87 more consistent with wording 96. So the whole thing was to make it easier. One thing that is easier about 96 is that it only takes it from one direction, where 87 is from the perspective of the lessee and the lessor. Governments technically don't have their own IT software that they rent out, right?
Yeah.
So it's only from the perspective of the government as a subscriber, rather than the transfer. So I think that makes it easier.
Yep. Yeah. The other thing that I like to cover on these presentation is the different costs in the SBITA life cycle. So you have, all of the costs prior to selecting a vendor, and what you do with those is when you expense those. And then the initial implementation costs, and then the ongoing costs. So do want to point out that in terms of determining what your subscription asset is, there is some work that you're going to be doing to determine if those costs related to your subscription-based IT arrangement should be expensed, or if they should be capitalized as part of the subscription asset. So that's another area that I like to point out where it's a little bit different nuance than 87.
Different than 87, but that is fairly consistent with 51. So 51 had those 3 stages and had the same, I think they call the stages a little bit differently, but there was the beginning stage where you're going to expense it, the middle stage where you're capitalizing it, and then the later maintenance stages where you're expensing it.
Yep, great. So we have an exposure draft out now, an implementation guide exposure draft that hits on subscription-based IT arrangements. And I think it does a good job of hitting on areas that we're starting to get these initial questions as we're working with clients on implementing. So I was wondering if you could share what GASB says about the subscription-based IT arrangements in the implementation guide. We have the one related to the implementation stage crossing over periods, and then the one related to perpetual licenses.
Well, I do want to point out that in this exposure draft, there's only 2 questions that are specifically related to SBITAs. And you might wonder why that's all the board, all the guidance the GASB staff is providing. And the reason is because of the similarities between 96 and 87. A lot of the guidance provided on implementing 87 can be analogized to 96. And so there's a lot of questions and answers out there already for, in 3 different implementation guides that you can apply. And some of those are very helpful when determining when you have control of a SBITA, for example, and how to bifurcate a contract into its components. So those are very helpful. There's 2 implementation guide questions. One is related to determining or deciding what to do when you have a contract where it automatically renews, which is probably much more common with the SBITA than with the lease. And so it was very relevant, particularly for SBITAs. But the question is, what do you do when you have that a SBITA where you don't have to do anything, it just automatically renews? It's the GASB's view that is essentially a termination option, that automatic renewal where you can opt out at any point on that renewal. And so you would treat it like it's an agreement with a regularly scheduled termination option.
Right. Seeing this a lot whenever we're helping. So we're starting to look at contracts, right, for the clients that we're advising, and we're seeing a lot of the 12 months with the automatic renewal, and it kind of just goes on and on and on. And you get back to the definition of what is a subscription-based IT arrangement. You have that for a period of time. And so I just heard a webinar yesterday where they said, that's a 12-month lease. You can kind of scope it out. but very clearly here, GASB saying no, it's a termination option. You don't get off the hook that easily, right? You actually got to think about how far down the road you're reasonably certain to terminate. And so in thinking about in practice how people are going to apply this, I'm assuming that they're going to apply the factors of obviously how often do I swap out this ERP system or the software module, but I'm assuming we're going to get some type of consensus or consistency around governments, maybe not in the initial year, but it'll be something similar to how capital assets are depreciated for a certain number of years. Not exactly the same, but the same idea. Because it's going to be really subjective from government to government, and I'm very interested to see where they land. And so I'm hoping that when GASB finalizes this question, that they maybe add a sentence or two reminding people, because it is a option to terminate, this is what you have to do with it. Because of that, I feel like that second part of the question, while it is in guidance, is left unanswered there in 4.7.
They will only provide that extra sentence if they get a lot of feedback. So anybody listening, you have till January 20th, I believe, to submit feedback on this.
Yep, definitely. So the last thing I wanted to do is just kind of talk about implementation. There's probably governments out there that are thinking, 630s, they just finished their 2020 audit, or maybe some of the 930s that are overachievers, and they're thinking about what do I need to be doing related to implementing. So anytime you've heard me talk before about the implementation, I try to go through those 4 phases of implementation, and really a lot of the governments that we're working with on this are really in phase 1 and phase 2. So what that means is they're doing training, they're doing stuff like listening to us on this podcast, they're attending webinars, kind of getting their handle around what a SBITA is, and then also they're doing some capture, right? Doing some template creation, looking at their departments, looking across the organization. Where do we have exposure of SBITAs, and just starting to feel good about completeness for those overachiever governments. But I really think first quarter 2023, there's going to be a big pickup in the amount of entities that are thinking about this, and so it'll be a challenge for some entities. They'll even be more exposure from a volume standpoint than GASB 87. Thinking of schools and healthcare, for example.
Well, in the training I did last week, where I introduced to them some examples of what SBITAs are, and we talked about the software as a service, the platform as a service, the infrastructure as a service, and then I asked the polling question: how ready, based on these examples, was this what you expected, or do you have a lot of work to do? And it was about 50-50, where half of the folks, or about 400 people in attendance, said we've got a lot of work to do. So I think just recognizing some examples will help individuals know what to look for. Your IT departments have to be part of this process, because they're the ones who are involved in these arrangements more than anybody.
Definitely. All right. Well, a lot of fun ahead, right? To GASB 87. Now let's knock out GASB 96. Thank you, Scott, very much for joining today. I do want to point out that we will have an article as well, as far as 3 tips for GASB 96 implementation, up on our website shortly. You can reach Scott at sanderson@cbh.com. You can reach me at danny.martinez@cbh.com. You can also find both of us on LinkedIn. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Danny, for hosting. Thanks to the audience for listening. And we'll see you at the next podcast.